I am Flavia Bellieni, Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and today we have with us Alan Bloomfield from the University of Western Australia. Today we are going to be discussing current challenges faced by the International Criminal Court and Bashar al-Assad's campaign in Syria, and particularly the issue associated with Palmyra. Thank you for being with us, Alan.
Thank you, Flavia. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Alan. And just returning to the issue of the effectiveness of the International Criminal Court, you have just mentioned that you believe the problem that we experience at the moment is that, as a matter of fact, the International Criminal Court would be quite effective. Sorry, when we are thinking about particularly the situation in Syria, to which extent the International Criminal Court could prevent the violation of human rights?
Syria is a very difficult case for the International Criminal Court for two reasons. The first is Syria is not a member, so the prosecutor cannot bring actions on... Well, there's three ways that indictment can begin at the court. The nation state can actually refer itself to the court. But Syria is not going to do that. It's not a member. Because it's not a member, the prosecutor cannot decide to issue an indictment. That's the second way. So it's only the third option which is available in Syria, and that's for the UN Security Council to refer the matter to the criminal court. But of course, Russia is a close ally of the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad's regime, a regime that has committed numerous mass atrocity crimes. We know now that they are responsible for using chemical weapons against their own people. And those are just the most serious of the atrocity crimes that have been committed in Syria. But the Russians are close allies of the Syrian regime. And so it's unlikely, I would say almost impossible, to imagine Russia not exercising its veto when other states tried to get the Security Council to refer any members of the Syrian regime to the court. Having said that, Islamic State has been essentially defeated in both Syria and Iraq now, with the fall of Raqqa in the last few weeks. So it's certainly possible to imagine Islamic State being, or members of Islamic State being referred to the court. However, the court, according to the principle of complementarity, its jurisdiction is only activated when a national court chooses not to prosecute an offender or an alleged offender. And so I would imagine certainly the Iraqi state, which is dysfunctional in some ways but still much more effective than the Syrian state, I would imagine they would be wanting to prosecute Islamic State criminals in their own courts. So perhaps only crimes that have been committed by Islamic State in Syria could potentially become the type of thing the court would be interested in, but not the regime. The regime will be protected by their Russian masters.
Thank you, Alan. And in your opinion, the claims that the International Criminal Court would erode state sovereignty, just give me some reflections on this argument, please.
Well, look, on the face of it, it does, in the sense that it's a new international institution which can potentially try heads of states and governments for crimes that they've committed that are not necessarily international in nature, in the sense that these crimes can be committed wholly within their borders and they could be held accountable in front of an international tribunal. Nevertheless, the court was set up in a way to try to reduce the impact on state sovereignty, and this is primarily with this complementarity principle. So the national court is expected to try an offender first, and only if a national court cannot actually go ahead and effectively prosecute does the court's jurisdiction become activated. If the court had had universal jurisdiction like an ordinary court does in Australia, there's no way the Rome Statute would have ever been drafted in the first place. So there are on the face of it, yes, the court is potentially in position or can potentially impose upon state sovereignty. It has been set up in a way to try to reduce that. I would also say one other thing. The role of the United Nations Security Council is controversial here because 3 members of the Security Council, 3 permanent members, the United States, China and Russia, are not members of the International Criminal Court. Nevertheless, they have the power to refer matters to the International Criminal Court or refer offenders to the International Criminal Court. This is how President Bashar al-Assad was referred. Sudan is not a member, but the Security Council referred him. And so when the great powers choose to bind other states and make them accountable or make the leaders of those states or citizens of those states accountable to laws which they themselves refuse to be accountable to, you could see why a lot of states would be upset and believe that the court, through the Security Council, or maybe I should put it the other way around, that the Security Council, through the court, was essentially imposing on their sovereignty. And this is one of the critiques or criticisms of the court that African states have levelled against it recently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Alan. And just wrapping up our interview, in your opinion, how Bashar al-Assad's campaign in Palmyra has had an impact in international norms and in the protection of a World Heritage site such as Palmyra?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and I've got to be careful here. It's still at the very early stages of this project. I've only really got my research design, gathered some evidence, and there's plenty more work on it to go. But my preliminary feelings about this that actually Bashar al-Assad has unintentionally strengthened what I call the anti-plunder and the anti-desecration norms. So it's clear they don't believe in these norms. They have bombed Aleppo's old city. They have shelled Crac de Chevaliers, a famous Crusader castle. Nevertheless, when they recaptured Palmyra for the first time in early 2016, they said they were saving it for humanity from Islamic State, because as we're all aware, Islamic State has damaged those temples and has plundered those artefacts. It's clear that the Syrian regime did not recapture Palmyra to protect the heritage. It's a strategically located town. There's an important airbase. When Islamic State came back and pushed them out several months after they first took the area in 2016, the regime abandoned the ruins and they abandoned the town, but they fought for and they kept the airbase. Clearly they're motivated by military necessity and not by concern for heritage, cultural heritage. Nevertheless, there's a paradox here. They have made the Syrian government have made a big PR circus out of this, and with the help of the Russians as well. And this, I think, clearly reflects the fact that the international community values these norms very strongly, and the Syrian government is essentially acting cynically and using these norms for their own purposes. But nevertheless, even though they don't believe in them, they are complying with them, which actually strengthens the norms. So it will be very interesting to see how this plays out in future. I mentioned in response to the question before that perhaps Islamic State members would be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity or other mass atrocity crimes. But given this precedent for prosecuting or successful prosecution of a person, an Islamic radical involved in destruction in ancient shrines in Timbuktu, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that the International Criminal Court might be interested in also prosecuting people in Syria, Islamic State members in Syria. Unfortunately, as I also said before, the Syrian government itself and its forces are essentially immune from the court. So they won't be getting prosecuted for their destruction of Crusader castles or Aleppo's old town.
Thank you very much, Alan.
No problems.
And thank you for being with us today. And for more information, please visit our website www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.